Hello, Paul. I just wanted to get your insights on a topic our analytical team have been looking at as part of our various reviews of the region, which is the accountability and mismanagement of the Australian government. Concerning you're a former officer and Australian, it would be interesting to know your thoughts about this. Do, do you mind if I
Yes,
record this call, Paul?
yeah. No, please do, Basil. And look, I mean, you and Bhargav have a listen to it later. I think we should distribute it to clients. I think one of the great things about Australia, Basil, is we can talk very openly and very critically of Australia without going to jail or generally without getting a slap on the wrist. But Australian government has become increasingly less accountable. And one of the big weaknesses in Australia is you've got two major political parties, and if you like, they trade jobs between being in government and being in opposition. The fact that there's only two major parties means there's generally a lack of accountability. And when you throw in the wealth of Australian society, gained of just natural resources that have been gifted to us, massive agricultural, massive marine resources, incredible oil and gas resources, virtually every mineral, including rare earth minerals, and of course, uranium, coal, iron ore galore. It patches up a lot of very inefficient governance. Bhargav, have you got anything you'd like to add or any samples you'd like me to talk about?
Certainly. Paul, I must underline here the case of Afghan interpreters who have had a really tough time in the last 2 decades being on the ground in the conflict zones of Afghanistan, helping the international forces, including Australian, and the process they have to go through to escape the Taliban regime after 2021. There seems to be a lack of accountability on part of the government and a lack of responsible approach to help these interpreters who have stood by the Afghan forces as well as the Australian forces on the ground against the Taliban in Afghanistan. Now, I have a larger question on hand as well. We'll come to that a little later about Australia's role in the conflict itself. But it would be interesting to get your take on the interpreter issue.
Oh, look, I think the interpreter issue is a microcosm within the larger issue, and that is Australia is very quick to support overseas operations, but it fails to do so with due consideration of trying to maintain some neutrality. It cowers in a dangerous way to America's will. Now, I'm not for 1 minute stating America, their path is not always right and just. That's for another day. But we need to consider the threats to us, but also the people we expose. The interpreters are a part of a wider Afghan refugee situation. And sadly, these kind of things in the Australian government, decisions are made in the safety and the sanctity of halls in Canberra, and the halls in Canberra are not accountable. There's been a lot more effort and publicity that has gone into the government trying to crucify Special Forces soldiers. Some of them have committed demeanours, but generally they're well-trained, brilliant, very nationalistic heroes, and they should be treated as such. But they don't get any positive play. The commander of the Australian military awarded himself a distinguished medal for active services. He actually removed the definition active services in the distinguished medal so he can decorate himself. Meanwhile, taking away subunit citations and banning a unit or a subunit of the commandos and special air services and taking away the unit citations because there were one or two bad eggs. Like, he was a commander. He hasn't punished the officers of the military or the direct officers in command. They've all whacked their head in the sand like those famous Aussie emus. In short, Bhargav, the fiasco of how long these visas take, they're quite happy to send people to war, but they don't look after the psychology of our own soldiers very well. They just offload that to psychologists at $300 an hour to string it all on. And they certainly don't respect the translators. You know, my own brother in uniform had to go on TV to gain publicity and public support, because without public support and popularity, it's like we're always talking about Modi's all about his own popularity. The Australian government's the same. They're not outcome focused, extremely inefficient. And the whole inefficiencies of Canberra are of major concern to me, Basil, to answer your question. And I think most veterans, most certainly Australian expatriates living abroad, get a much different view on Australia when you're outside of the media and when you're outside of the easy entitled street that Australia's become, and the public service and the government of the day typify that. Bhargav?
So, Paul, here I must underline one critical aspect which I think can't be missed. That is Australia's decision to go to war in the first place. And again, as an Indian, I must underline here. Ever since the LTT fiasco in late 1980s, Indian government has been very, very circumspect about where they're going to deploy their troops overseas. Unless there is a very clear-cut plan on what they want to achieve, they do not deploy, with the exception of the UN missions. So Australia followed the American government, entered the war with the American forces. To what end? Doesn't that reek of responsible governance, lack of understanding of foreign policy, and clear outcomes from a conflict?
Look, I think 100%. I think wonderful summary, Bhargav. You know, it goes back to blindly following Saddam Hussein, weapons of mass destruction, lies, it's clearly lies. Any intelligence officer that didn't see that beforehand could certainly see it on arrival. You know, we spoke to a close associate of mine that was sacked in the theatre for actually pointing out to the American forces that their analytical processes are flawed. He was reinstated when he was proven to be right by the senior American general in the theatre. But the bottom line is Australia is inept in terms of understanding geopolitical issues. They're stuck in the colonial era. They've really become a parasite on America. They think that America is going to save us. We're allowing America to come in and set up presence against China with air bases and missile launching opportunities. And, you know, one side of me as an ex-military officer understands the hype that they come up with, but the reality is, from a long-term perspective, like we have made enemies in the Middle East, we're making a lot in our own region. Interestingly, often when we jump up on our soapbox and criticise China, they cut various trades, and that wonderful ally of ours, United States of America, jump in and take those markets. And again, it's very sad because politicians in Canberra aren't the most versatile. They build up wonderful compliance systems and regulatory systems, but elect to ignore them whenever they do something wrong. The fiasco in Manus Island, appointing a person and a company that was neither qualified nor had integrity, and spend millions of dollars on them to go into Manus Island, just reeks. If it was done in Indonesia, the Australian government would be banging on about corruption, nepotism, but we do it repeatedly. And there's two sets of rules in Australia, those for Canberra and those funding them, and a total another set of rules for Australian society itself.
Paul, it's interesting that you mentioned two sets of rules. If we focus on the case of Rio Tinto and the fiasco with the ancient caves, do you think the top executives escaped with just a slap on the wrist?
Oh, look, I think that's Australia at its worst. I think, you know, imagine if I went down and got some TNT and blew up a 46,000-year-old cave full of Aboriginal heritage. Would I be walking the streets? Would I get a slap on the wrist and told, go and work for another major taxpayer? This will blow over. You know, I can't remember exactly what occurred, but they announced some punitive measures to appease the media. And I think the CEO resigned and two top executives were, quote, criticised for inadequacies. I mean, if that was a member of Australia, a person, they'd be in jail, mate, and there'd be it'd be a criminal charge, and so it should be. The mere fact that criminal charges haven't been laid, both against the directors of the company and that for their culpability and the vicarious liability which that heinous act held, is of major concern. And the fact that the executives continue to walk the streets without charges, can go and get another job. I'm sure if we research it 12 months from now, there will have been some sidekicks of money from Rio Tinto, and they'll be set up with another job in another major resource company, because the government doesn't see them as people that should be culpable. They see these as their buddies that send them money and get them into political power by backing everything they do. And this lack of accountability, I mean, you can talk about great democracies basically need the separations of power, but at the moment, the Australian media and certain stakeholders, including major companies like Rio Tinto and most of the major oil and gas resource companies and mining companies, they're funding governments and they're manipulating governments. You know, we've seen fiascos coming out of Canberra recently in terms of billions of dollars of contracts and then those being abused commercially. So there is a fundamental lack of accountability. And I think the Rio Tinto example is one of hundreds I could quote, but it's an extreme one. And the fact that they've got away with it without not just the guys that resigned going to jail, but what about all the other company executives, you know, who headed up community relations, who headed up community mediation, who ordered that explosion to occur? I mean, you know, a lot of countries, this would have led to massive riots. It's only the fact that the Indigenous people in the Pilbara region are living in such a remote society and they've become such a minority in their own country that Australia gets away with it. And the problem is, the theme is, even in Parliament House, sexual assaults get pushed aside because they're actually, until recently, politicians were exempt from the rules that everyone else has to live by in society in terms of sexual harassment and sexual assaults. So, yeah, sadly, in a great country like Australia, one which I'm very proud of and, you know, have great optimism that will rebuild, but it's like Australia just announced its rugby team for the World Cup after 20 years of hoping, you know, the old generation's going to come good. They've basically sacked the old boys and brought in some young blood. Well, that's easy for a rugby coach to do. It's very difficult to clean out the Australian government. They become very entitled and lack accountability in Canberra. It really doesn't matter which government's in charge or which public service, because they ultimately work hand in hand for mutual existence.
So, Paul, you make a very interesting point, which only leads me to think the disease of crony capitalist as well as military-industrial complex has spread to Australia as well, especially when we consider the lack of integrity with Department of Defense tenders and related auditing firms like KPMG and PwC. Would you like to weigh in on that?
Look, I mean, Canberra's, in my opinion, an unethical, unaccountable joke. All right. Now, sadly, Australia has a really talented public service, but it's also got massive elements of the public service that are lazy and entitled. The problem is the really talented members of the public service are trying to do their job, while the entitled, lazy ones are trying to stab them in the back. And the real problem, and you highlight the PwC and the KPMG fiascos. Between them, they had, you know, several $1 billion in contracts. I think it was PwC actually got documents in confidence as a part of their consulting and then used that to establish a product and how to beat the Australian government at its own game to avoid tax. And it's only that these egos that do these kind of things in the big consulting for brag about them and they get caught. And then, of course, KPMG, it's been accused recently by a couple of whistleblowers of scamming taxpayers. And there are other peripheral consulting companies in Canberra. One of the great problems is, I think one of them, a small private consulting company, recently got caught into the scandal where one of the companies sort of spoke, instead of addressing their own mismanagement, deflected a lot of mud at a smaller consulting company to say their website basically talks about how it's got, you know, unfettered access to defence and national security agencies. And that's the problem. You know, that particular consulting company, no names, it actually relocated to Canberra because it couldn't compete unless it was in Canberra. And in Canberra, it can compete because of the old boy network, knock on the door, not have to compete. Just have some, hey, let's just do a bidding process, but there's only 3 of you, and every third one you're going to get because we're the old boy network. They sit around and they write hundreds of pages of documents and send bills for hundreds of thousands of dollars. And what they're doing is what there's many public servants can do equally well, but they just lack accountability, lack sincerity. They'd rather not put their name to anything, have others write it all in the name of experts doing it. But, you know, a lot of these guys are ex-artillery officers, ex-armoured officers, ex-infantry officers. They can't do this any better than the public servants. It's just the public servants have got massive budgets and can offload their work responsibilities and sadly their accountability to have someone else do it for them. And then if it goes pear-shaped, the officials can, you know, proverbially wipe their hands from everything. But Australia needs a massive shake-up. You know, it needs its own version of Clean the Swamp, but it's not going to happen because the Australian politicians ensure that everybody in the country is regulated over the top in terms of regulation and compliance, but they themselves, including the public service, have systems to ensure that no fingers can ever be pointed at them. And if you look at now, there's the big witch hunt on consulting companies, and Canberra and all the ministers are very quick to point out the evils of consultancy companies. Okay, so why have you been hiring them? Why are you spending $27 billion a year on consulting companies? Why aren't you pointing the finger at why did we delegate it? Why didn't we check on it? How do we not have controls on it? And this is yet another example, Bhargav, that if you're not accountable, you won't be accountable. And if you're not accountable, things get out of hand. Ultimate power ultimately corrupts. At least it makes for escalating levels of incompetence that are a natural spin-off from unaccountability. So it is very sad, and this is, of course, all getting patched up by Australia's low population combined with massive mineral wealth, and it's sad, mate. But I'm not going to mince my words with it. It's appalling, which is why I think we should send it to our clients. And I know many of our clients and many of my peers won't agree with what I say. It's because they actually believe the media ice cream that's getting pumped out of them during their careers, and they still continue to think that they're critical objective thinkers. But unfortunately, they're not. They're thus they're a part of the problem.
Thank you, Paul. Those are very critical points and very troubling trends indeed in one of the largest economies in the region. Thank you for that.
Okay, thanks, Bassel. Anything else?
Nothing from my end. Thank you, Paul and Bhargav. That was really helpful.
Okay, I hope it helps the team. Cheers.
Bye.